Aisha had spent her entire life fighting against the odds. Born and raised in a cramped one-room apartment in Ajij, Lagos, she knew what it meant to struggle. Every day, she watched her mother, Mama Aisha, wake before dawn, arranging her small vegetable stall at the market, hoping to sell enough onions, tomatoes, and peppers to buy food for the night. Her older brother, Bello, had searched endlessly for work. He had applied for factory jobs, construction work, and even security guard positions, but with no connections and no experience, he was always turned away. He wasn't lazy, but in Lagos, connections often mattered more than effort. Their father had died years ago, leaving behind only debts. Now, they had another burden, Uncle Denjuma, their late father's elder brother, who was gravely ill and needed urgent surgery. The hospital had already warned them, without the surgery, he wouldn't make it. Aisha had always been the family's hope. She was the first to go to university, the first to wear a graduation gown. When she got a job as a junior accountant at a small firm on Victoria Island, she believed things would finally get better. But life in Lagos had other plans. Her salary barely covered transport, food, and sending money home. Despite her struggles, she remained hopeful, clinging to the dream that one day, things would change. However, Lagos was not kind to a girl like her. Whenever a man showed interest, it was always the same question, "Where is your family from?" And when she answered, everything changed. Men pulled away. They wanted a woman from an influential family, not one from a struggling background. No one wanted to build a future with someone like her. It hurt. Every time, it hurt. But she told herself she would survive. Until the night her mother brought home a letter that would change everything. Aisha returned home late that evening, her body aching from the stress of the long day. The scorching Lagos sun had been merciless, and the Danfo buses had been packed beyond capacity. She had fought her way through the rush-hour crowd, just to return to the cramped one-room apartment she shared with her mother and brother. She was used to exhaustion. Used to the disappointment of delayed salaries. Used to the stares and whispers that came with being a girl from the slums. But she was not used to the sight that awaited her when she stepped into the house. Mama Aisha sat on their worn-out wooden chair, clutching a brown envelope tightly in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, and Bello, her older brother, sat on the floor beside her, his expression unreadable. The air in the room was thick with tension. Something was wrong. Aisha frowned, dropping her handbag on the only table in the room. "Mama, what is it?" Her mother hesitated, her lips pressing together as if she were battling with the right words. Then, finally, she placed the envelope on the table, her voice barely above a whisper. "Aisha, a rich man wants to marry you." The words hit Aisha like a blow. She blinked. Surely, she had misheard. "What?" Her voice came out hoarse. Mama Aisha swallowed hard, as if bracing herself for the storm she knew would follow. "His name is Alhaji Musa. He is one of the wealthiest men in Lagos. He sent this proposal." Aisha's heart pounded. Alhaji Musa? She had heard of him before. He was a man of mystery, a businessman with influence in places people feared to speak about. Some said he owned properties in Banana Island, others said he had connections with powerful politicians. But one thing was certain, he was rich. Very rich. Her hands shook as she picked up the letter and pulled out the neatly folded sheet inside. "I am 60 years old. I am a man of means. I will take care of your daughter and your family. This marriage will bring her comfort and security." Aisha's fingers tightened around the paper. 60, she whispered, looking up at her mother in disbelief. "Mama, he's old enough to be my father." Her mother's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Aisha, I know this is a lot. But think about it. Look at us. Your uncle needs surgery. Bello needs a job. We are barely surviving." Aisha's chest tightened. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. Bello stood up and opened it. 3 men stood outside, carrying sacks of rice, cartons of indomie, and bottles of vegetable oil. Behind them, another man held a thick white envelope, its contents unknown but obvious. "The boss says this is just a small gift," one of them said, his tone respectful but firm. "There will be more when he comes to see your daughter." Aisha felt as though the walls were closing in on her. Mama Aisha covered her mouth, a single sob escaping her lips. Bello clenched his fists but said nothing. For the first time in a long while, their home had enough food. Aisha had spent nights listening to her mother cry, wondering how she would feed them. She had seen her brother struggle, rejected from jobs just because he came from the slums. She had seen Uncle Denjuma grow weaker, his illness threatening to take his life. And now, a solution stood before them, wrapped in a contract she never asked for. Her mother turned to her, voice pleading. "Aisha, this man can change our lives." Aisha wanted to scream. To tell them that this wasn't how life was supposed to work. That marriage wasn't meant to be a sacrifice. That love was supposed to be a choice, not a price to be paid for survival. But when she opened her mouth, no words came out. Silence filled the room. And in that silence, Aisha realized something. It didn't matter what she wanted. Because, in their world, love was a privilege the poor could not afford. Aisha spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, unable to close her eyes. The air inside their tiny room felt heavier than usual, suffocating even. Every time she blinked, she saw the letter. Every time she inhaled, she smelled the scent of freshly delivered rice and indomie, luxuries that were now stacked in the corner of their small home like trophies of her impending sacrifice. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Aisha, this man can change our lives." Change their lives. But at what cost? She sat up and turned to the wooden table in the middle of the room. On it, the brown envelope still lay open, its message unchanged. She could barely process it. Al-Haji Musa. 60 years old. Wealthy. Powerful. Wants to marry her. The idea alone made her stomach churn. Aisha had grown up dreaming of a different kind of love. She had imagined a man who would hold her hand, laugh at her jokes, whisper sweet words into her ears. She had dreamed of a husband who would be her friend, not a man who had lived a full life before she was even born. This wasn't what she wanted. But what choice did she have? She turned her gaze to the thin mattress on the floor where Bello slept. Even in his sleep, his face looked troubled. He carried the weight of their family's struggles on his shoulders, even though there was nothing he could do to fix them. And then there was Mama Aisha, curled up on the other side of the room, her hands still clutching her prayer beads in her sleep. Aisha's eyes burned with tears. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about them. Uncle Denjuma needed surgery, and it wasn't just a small operation. It was the kind of procedure that cost millions of naira, an amount they couldn't even dream of. Bello needed a break, an opportunity to prove that he was more than just a jobless man from the slums. Mama Aisha deserved peace. She had spent her entire life worrying, carrying burdens too heavy for one woman alone. Aisha swallowed the lump in her throat. This wasn't about love. It was about survival. She lay back down, turning to face the wall as a single tear slid down her cheek. By morning, her mind was made up. The next day, she found her mother outside, arranging her vegetables at the front of their apartment. Aisha's heart pounded in her chest as she approached her. "Mama," she called softly. Her mother turned around, her eyes filled with quiet hope. Aisha swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak the words that would seal her fate. "If this is the price I have to pay," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "then I'll do it." Mama Aisha gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Tears welled in her eyes as she pulled Aisha into a tight embrace. "Oh, my child. You are making the right decision. Aisha felt her mother's body shake with emotion, but she remained still. She wasn't sure if her own body could handle the weight of what she had just agreed to. Bello, who had been sitting on a stool nearby, suddenly stood up, his face hard. So that's it? He demanded. You're just going to sell yourself off like that? Aisha turned to face him, pain flashing in her eyes. What choice do I have, Bello? You always have a choice, he shot back. You just don't like the consequences of the other option. His words stung. Aisha clenched her fists. And what is the other option? Watching Uncle Danjuma die? Watching Mama struggle every day until she collapses one morning in this market? Watching you get rejected over and over again because no one will give you a chance? Bello's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. This isn't fair, Aisha. She laughed bitterly. Nothing in life is fair, Bello. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply and shook his head. Fine. Do what you want. He turned and walked away, disappearing down the narrow alley that led out of their neighborhood. Aisha watched him go, her heart heavy. Mama Aisha took her hands, squeezing them tightly. Don't mind him, my daughter. He just doesn't understand. You are doing this for all of us. Aisha forced a small smile. But deep down, she wasn't sure if she was doing this for them. Or if she was just convincing herself that she had no choice. The call. Later that evening, a black car pulled up outside their home. A tall man in a white kaftan stepped out and approached them with a polite smile. Good evening, Ma, he greeted, nodding at Mama Aisha before turning to Aisha. I am Malam Ibrahim, Al-Haji Musa's personal assistant. Aisha felt her pulse quicken. He wishes to meet you in person tomorrow, the man continued. He has already made arrangements for you to come to his residence in Kauai. A driver will pick you up in the morning. The reality of her decision slammed into her like a wave. This was real now. There was no turning back. She nodded slowly. Okay. Malam Ibrahim smiled. Al-Haji is a good man. You will be well taken care of. She wasn't sure if he was trying to comfort her, but his words did nothing to ease the knot in her stomach. As he turned to leave, he paused, reaching into his pocket and handing Mama Aisha another white envelope. A small token from Al-Haji Musa, as promised. Mama Aisha's hands shook as she took it. She didn't even need to open it to know it was filled with cash. Aisha swallowed hard, watching the car drive away. Tomorrow, she would meet the man she was about to marry. Tomorrow, her life would change forever. And for the first time, she truly understood what it meant to sacrifice one's dreams for family. Aisha barely slept that night. She lay on her thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the city, the honking of Danfo buses, the occasional shouts of traders still trying to make last-minute sales, and the distant hum of generators. Her mind raced. Tomorrow, she would be leaving this life behind. The poverty, the struggle, the endless cycle of suffering. But at what cost? Her body felt heavy, weighed down by the burden of what she was about to do. When morning came, she barely had time to process what was happening before the black car arrived. Mama Aisha fussed over her, adjusting her hijab, making sure she looked presentable. Bello, however, refused to come out of his room. His silent protest spoke volumes. The driver, a middle-aged man with a professional yet distant demeanor, opened the car door for her. She hesitated. Just for a second. Then she stepped inside. The journey from Ajij to Kauai felt like stepping into a different world. The bustling streets slowly gave way to wide, tree-lined avenues. The noise faded. The air seemed cleaner. The houses became larger, the roads smoother. When they finally arrived at Al-Haji Musa's residence, Aisha's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a house, it was a mansion. The gates, tall and majestic, slid open as they approached. Inside, the compound was enormous. Well-manicured gardens stretched around the property. A grand fountain stood in the middle of the driveway, water trickling down in an endless, elegant flow. The car pulled to a stop in front of the main entrance. Aisha's palms were sweaty as she stepped out. She was immediately greeted by a well-dressed man, Malam Ibrahim, the personal assistant from yesterday. "Welcome, Aisha," he said warmly. "Al-Haji Musa is waiting for you inside." Her heart pounded as she followed him through the grand entrance. The interior of the house was just as breathtaking as the outside. High ceilings, chandeliers, and polished marble floors. The air smelled expensive, like imported furniture and fresh flowers. And then she saw him. Al-Haji Musa. He was exactly as she had imagined. Old. Wrinkled. A slow, deliberate way of moving. His traditional white agbada was pristine, his gold-rimmed glasses perched carefully on his nose. But his eyes were sharp. Observant. He watched her with a quiet intensity, as if he was studying her. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to step forward. "Good morning, sir," she greeted, her voice barely above a whisper. He chuckled softly. "You don't have to be so formal, my dear." She nodded, unsure of what else to say. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Come, sit with me." She did. For the next hour, they spoke. Or rather, he spoke, while she listened. He told her about his life, his businesses, his beliefs. She listened, answering when necessary, keeping her responses short. When he finally leaned back and smiled, there was something unreadable in his gaze. "You are a very intelligent young woman, Aisha. I admire that." She forced a small smile. "Thank you, sir." He chuckled again. "We will be married in 3 days." Her stomach twisted. So soon? She had expected at least a few weeks, some time to adjust. But she should have known better. This wasn't a love story. This was a transaction. And transactions were handled swiftly. The day of the wedding arrived faster than Aisha had expected. She sat in front of a large mirror in the guest room Al-Haji Musa had prepared for her in his mansion. The makeup artist carefully applied powder to her face, making her skin glow under the soft light. The white lace dress she wore was simple but elegant. Not too extravagant, but still beautiful. Outside, the wedding was already in motion. It was a grand affair. Dignitaries, business moguls, and political figures had all gathered. Traditional drummers played their rhythms, and women in brightly colored ghillie danced joyfully. Aisha heard the sounds but felt none of the joy. Mama Aisha was overjoyed. She had cried when she saw the wedding dress, whispering, "You are going to live like a queen." Bello, however, had refused to attend. The silence between them had grown, and Aisha knew deep down that she was losing him. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. Just get through today, she told herself. Just survive this. When it was time, she was led outside. The crowd fell silent as she stepped forward, walking toward Al-Haji Musa. He stood at the front, waiting for her. His agbada was even more elaborate today, a deep shade of blue embroidered with gold. He looked powerful. Untouchable. Her feet felt heavy, like they wanted to turn around and run. But she didn't run. She kept walking. The officiant's voice was a blur. The vows felt hollow. But then came the moment that mattered. "Do you, Aisha, take Al-Haji Musa to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Silence. The world seemed to pause. Aisha's heart pounded. For a split second, she considered saying no. She imagined running. leaving everything behind. Starting over. But then she thought of her mother. She thought of Bello. She thought of Uncle Dan Juma. And she knew. This wasn't about her. So she inhaled deeply, steeled herself, and whispered the words that sealed her fate. I do. The crowd erupted in cheers. Alhaji Musa smiled. The ring was placed on her finger. And just like that, she was now Mrs. Musa. The celebration lasted for hours. People danced, money was sprayed, and guests feasted on plates of jollof rice, suya, and pounded yam. Aisha barely touched her food. She just sat there, smiling when necessary, nodding when expected. And then, at the end of the night, she was led to her new home. Her new life. Her new reality. But as she stepped into the mansion once again, something deep inside her whispered that nothing was as it seemed. And she had no idea just how true that was. Aisha sat stiffly in the back of the luxurious car as it sped toward her new home. The echoes of the wedding ceremony still rang in her ears, the loud music, the flashing cameras, the excited cheers of people who barely knew her but had come to celebrate. She had smiled. She had nodded. She had played the role of a perfect bride. But now, as the night deepened and the city lights blurred past her, the weight of her reality settled heavily on her chest. She was married. To a man she barely knew. To a man she did not love. The car pulled into the massive gates of Alhaji Musa's mansion, and Aisha's breath hitched as she took in the sight before her. The estate looked even grander at night, the outdoor lights illuminating the well-manicured gardens and the luxurious cars parked in the driveway. This was her home now. But it didn't feel like home. A well-dressed housekeeper stood at the entrance, bowing slightly as she welcomed her. Good evening, madam. Your room is ready. Aisha nodded, her throat dry. She followed the woman inside, her footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The house was eerily quiet despite its grandeur. The wedding guests had been left behind. Now, it was just her and Alhaji Musa. Her stomach twisted uncomfortably. She was expected to share a bed with her husband tonight. Her heart pounded as she entered the master bedroom. It was enormous, more than 10 times the size of the one-room apartment she had grown up in. The bed was massive, covered in crisp white sheets, with soft golden light from the chandelier casting a warm glow over everything. Aisha sat at the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her body was tense. She could hear the shower running in the bathroom. Alhaji Musa was inside. Her breath became shallow as she tried to prepare herself for what was to come. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The water continued running. Aisha frowned. What was taking so long? She hesitated, then stood up, slowly approaching the bathroom door. She raised a hand, ready to knock. But before she could, the door creaked open. And what she saw made her entire body freeze. A young man stepped out. Tall. Strong. Handsome. His hair was damp, water droplets still clinging to his skin. His towel hung loosely around his waist. His eyes, sharp and observant, locked onto hers. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Aisha," he said softly. She gasped. That voice. It was Alhaji Musa's voice. But that was impossible. She shook her head, panic creeping into her veins. No, this can't be real. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. It's me, Aisha. She backed away, her body trembling. Where is my husband? The man exhaled deeply. I am your husband. She shook her head violently. No, you're lying. She turned to run, but he caught her wrist gently, his touch firm but not forceful. "Aisha," he said again, his voice calm but filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "I can explain." She yanked her arm free, her heart racing. "Explain what?" she demanded, her voice rising. "That you tricked me? That you're not who you said you were?" She felt like the walls were closing in. Who was this man? Where was the 60-year-old husband she had just married? He ran a hand through his damp hair, sighing. "I never lied to you, Aisha. I just didn't tell you the full truth." Her fists clenched. "Then tell me now." There was a long pause. Then, finally, he spoke. "My name is still Al-Haji Musa," he said. "But the man you and everyone else believed I was a disguise." Aisha stared at him, unblinking. "A disguise? What do you mean?" she whispered. He hesitated before answering. "I used makeup, prosthetics, and acting to appear as an old man." Her knees went weak. Her mind struggled to process what she was hearing. "Why?" she croaked. His expression softened. "Because I needed to know if you were real." Her body stiffened. "What do you mean real?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. He inhaled deeply. "Aisha, I have wealth beyond imagination. But I have seen how money changes people, how it brings out greed, how it blinds people to the things that truly matter." A lump formed in her throat. "So, this was a test?" He nodded. "I needed to know if you were someone who would marry for money, or for something more." Tears stung Aisha's eyes. "So you tricked me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "You let me believe I was marrying a 60-year-old man?" His gaze was unreadable. "Would you have agreed to marry me if you knew the truth?" Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Would she have? If she had known he was young, rich, and powerful, would she have thought any differently? She didn't know. And that scared her. Her breathing was unsteady. Everything she thought she knew had crumbled. The life-changing decision she had made for her family, was it all based on a lie? Or was it something else entirely? Her eyes burned with frustration and confusion. "I need time," she whispered. Al-Haji Musa, or whoever he really was, nodded slowly. "I understand." She turned, walking toward the massive bed, her legs feeling like lead. She didn't know what to believe anymore. All she knew was that nothing in her life had prepared her for this. And her story was only beginning. Aisha lay in bed that night, her mind restless. The weight of the truth pressed heavily on her chest. Al-Haji Musa, her husband, was not a 60-year-old man. He was young, strong, and undeniably attractive. He had tricked her, tested her, and shaken the foundation of everything she thought she knew. But what unsettled her the most was not the lie. It was the way her heart had raced when she first saw him. The way his deep, steady voice had sent a shiver down her spine. The way, despite her anger, she had wanted to listen to him. She turned on her side, staring at the luxurious room around her. She had never slept in such comfort before. The bed was soft, the air cool, the silence peaceful. Yet her heart was far from peaceful. Her husband, if she could still call him that, had given her space, choosing to sleep in a different room. But her mind kept returning to the way he had looked at her, the softness in his voice when he told her, "I understand." For the first time since this marriage had been arranged, she felt something other than fear. She felt curiosity. The next morning, Aisha woke up feeling different. The anger she had felt the night before had dulled into something else. She wasn't sure what it was, acceptance, perhaps? Or maybe the beginning of understanding? She found her way to the dining room, expecting to eat alone. But there he was. Al-Haji Musa, young, handsome, and no longer pretending to be someone else. He sat at the large dining table, flipping through the pages of a newspaper. When he saw her, he smiled gently. "Good morning, Aisha." Her heart skipped a beat. She forced herself to sit across from him, nodding stiffly. "Good morning." The food was already served: fresh fruits, warm bread, eggs, and tea. She hesitated before reaching for a slice of bread. She could feel his eyes on her. "I meant what I said," he spoke after a while. "I understand why you feel betrayed. And I won't rush you into anything. This is your home now, but I will give you space." Aisha exhaled. "Why did you do it?" He put down the newspaper. "Because I wanted to know if you were the kind of woman who saw beyond wealth. I've seen people change because of money. I didn't want a wife who loved riches. I wanted a wife who had a good heart." Aisha swallowed. "And? What did you find out?" He smiled. "That my grandfather was right about you. You are extraordinary." She looked down, her cheeks warming. She didn't know why, but hearing that made her feel something she wasn't ready to name. Falling slowly. Days passed. Then weeks. And slowly, things began to change. Aisha no longer felt trapped. She found herself watching him, observing the way he carried himself. How he was kind to the workers in the house. How he spoke with wisdom beyond his years. How he never pressured her but always made sure she was comfortable. He was patient. He didn't demand affection. He didn't try to win her with money. Instead, he talked to her. He listened. And before she even realized it, Aisha began to laugh with him. She began to enjoy their late-night conversations. She began to look forward to seeing him at breakfast. And one day, something unexpected happened. She missed him. He had gone on a business trip, leaving the house unusually quiet. And she found herself restless. She hated the silence. She hated not seeing him at dinner. She hated that she missed the way his eyes always searched for hers across the table. It was in that moment that she knew. She was falling in love with him. When he returned, something had changed. Aisha no longer looked at him with uncertainty. She saw him for who he really was: her husband, her companion, the man who had tested her, but had also shown her kindness. One evening, as they walked in the garden together, she stopped suddenly and turned to him. "Why me?" she asked. He smiled. "Because you are different, Aisha. Because you are strong. Because you are real." She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel everything. She took a deep breath. And then, softly, she whispered, "I think I'm falling in love with you." His eyes widened slightly, but then his expression softened into something gentle. He reached for her hand, holding it carefully, as if she were something precious. "You don't have to rush," he said quietly. "But I will wait for you, Aisha. For as long as it takes." She smiled. For the first time, this marriage no longer felt like a sacrifice. It felt like the beginning of something beautiful. And she knew, deep in her heart, that she had found something more precious than wealth. She had found love. Aisha stood by the balcony that evening, watching the Lagos skyline light up as night fell over the city. A cool breeze brushed against her skin, sending a soft shiver down her spine. It had been weeks since she had confessed to Alhaji Musa, her husband, that she was falling in love with him. Since then, everything had changed. Their conversations had grown deeper. Their laughter had become more frequent. And every time he looked at her, she felt a warmth she had never known before. She heard the door open behind her, and her heart recognized him before she even turned around. Alhaji Musa walked toward her, his steps slow, measured. He was dressed in a simple white kaftan, his sleeves rolled up slightly. "You like it here, don't you?" he asked, stopping beside her. Aisha smiled softly. Yes. It's peaceful. He nodded, looking out at the city. I never used to notice things like this. The quiet moments. She glanced at him. What changed? He turned his head to face her, his eyes full of something deep and unreadable. You. Her heart skipped a beat. They stood in silence for a moment, letting the city hum beneath them. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. His fingers were warm, firm yet gentle, as they wrapped around hers. He exhaled, as if gathering his thoughts. Aisha, I have always been careful with my heart. Careful with who I let in. She watched him, listening. But with you, he continued, his thumb brushing over her skin, it's different. I don't want to be careful anymore. Aisha felt her breath hitch. She had spent her whole life believing love was something distant, something meant for other people. Yet here she was, standing beside a man who had once been a stranger, but who now felt like home. She turned fully to face him, looking into his eyes. I don't want to be careful either, she whispered. Something flickered in his gaze, something raw, something real. And then, slowly, he raised his hand to her cheek, his fingers brushing against her skin like a silent question. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. And in that moment, she knew. She was his. And he was hers. Days turned into weeks, and their love deepened. Aisha no longer hesitated when he reached for her hand. She no longer avoided his gaze when he told her how beautiful she was. She allowed herself to love him freely, without fear, without doubt. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Alhaji Musa reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Aisha's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a delicate gold bracelet encrusted with tiny diamonds. For you, he said softly, fastening it around her wrist. She looked at him, overwhelmed. It's beautiful. He smiled. Not as beautiful as you. Her heart swelled. She placed her hand over his. You don't have to buy me things to make me happy. His smile widened. I know. But I want to. She chuckled, shaking her head. And then, suddenly, he grew serious. Aisha, he said, holding her gaze. Are you happy? She didn't need to think. She nodded. Yes. More than I ever thought I could be. His expression softened with relief. That's all I ever wanted. She reached up, touching his face. And you? His fingers tightened around hers. I have never been happier in my life. That night, something changed. Aisha knew it from the moment he reached for her hand and led her to their bedroom. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Only love. She stood before him, her heart pounding as he cupped her face in his hands. You are my wife, he whispered. And I will cherish you for as long as I live. She swallowed hard, emotions overwhelming her. I love you. And then, softly, he kissed her. It was slow, deep, full of everything they had never said out loud. The world melted away. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not how their love had begun. Not the lies, not the past. Only this. Only them. And as they lay together, hands entwined, hearts beating as one, Aisha knew she had found what she never thought possible. A love that was real. A love that was hers. And in Alhaji Musa's arms, she had finally come home. Months turned into years, and what had once been a marriage of necessity had transformed into something neither of them had expected, a love that stood the test of time. Aisha and Alhaji Musa built their world together, not just as husband and wife, but as partners. She no longer saw him as the man who had tested her. She saw him as the man who had taught her what love truly meant. Their love was deep, effortless, and undeniable. As their love grew, so did their lives. Alhaji Musa encouraged Aisha to follow her dreams. She had always been brilliant, and with his support, she went back to school and earned a master's degree in finance. She no longer worked for others. She became a businesswoman in her own right, running successful companies alongside her husband. Together, they built an empire. But through it all, their love remained their greatest wealth. Their home was no longer just a house, it was a place filled with laughter, warmth, and love. They were blessed with children, 3 boys and 2 girls, each a reflection of the love they had nurtured. Aisha was not just a wife, she was a mother, a friend, and the heartbeat of their home. And through every challenge, every storm, every hardship, they held on to each other. They never forgot how their love had begun. And they never took it for granted. Decades passed, and the world around them changed. Their children grew, built lives of their own, and started families. But Aisha and Musa remained the same, best friends, lovers, and soulmates. The fire that had once started slowly had only grown stronger with time. Even as wrinkles formed on their faces. Even as their hair turned gray. Their love never faded. It blossomed. They still took long walks together in the garden. They still held hands under the moonlight. They still whispered words of love in the quiet of the night. They had once been strangers. They had once been bound by duty. But they had found forever in each other's arms. One evening, many years later, Aisha and Musa sat on their balcony, watching the sun set over the city. She turned to him, her heart swelling with the same love she had felt for decades. "Do you regret anything?" she asked softly. He smiled, taking her hand in his. "Not a single moment." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Neither do I." And as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in golden hues, they sat in peaceful silence. He was hers. And she was his. For now. For always. For eternity. A love that began as a test had become a legacy. A love that blossomed till the end of time. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share.